to have you here today. It's great to see you. I'm Linda Coltman. I should have introduced myself as I started talking. And I just wanted to kind of go over a little bit about me. I'm actually a graduate student in the Faculty of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences. I've just completed, I'm working on completing my second master's degree. I did my first one in political science entirely in the classroom, and I did most of my second one in sociology entirely online. So doing that, I've had experience over 8 terms of this. I'm entering my 8th term as a GA and 2 terms as a TA, half of which were online, half of which were actually in the classroom setting. So any of you who might have questions about those kind of functions, I'm hoping I can answer them for you. And I'm hoping this session today to provide you with feedback that's applicable to whether you're doing a hybrid course, whether you're doing classroom work, or you're actually entirely online as a GA. And I'm just going to pass it over to Sula now for her to introduce herself. I look forward to talking to you myself later.
Thanks, Linda. Hi, everyone. I'm Sula Sarah, and I'm the team lead of academic partnerships in the Department of Continuing Education here at the University of Windsor. I work closely with faculty and industry experts to develop some engaging and flexible programming. They're all non-credit courses and programs, and I've worked with continuing education for maybe the last 4 or 5 years. I've been at the university for 20 years, and originally in student development and support or student affairs, working with transition programming, leadership development, and training, and helping to prepare students to take on various leadership roles. And currently I'm taking the university teaching certificate courses. And yeah, I look forward to getting to know you guys throughout this, and I'll pass it over back to Linda.
Thanks, Sula. And with that, before I just start going to our actual slide content, I did want to acknowledge 2 things. One, we've just turned on the recording as we did our introductions. That does mean this session is being recorded and will be available to you by link later after the session. But as I said before, everything now that's being recorded as part of video, microphone, and chat actually becomes part of the official record. And with that, I also want to apologize. My Cogeco connection has gotten weak over the past hour. I'd love to actually turn on my camera, but the internet connection is preventing me from doing it. So hopefully I'll be able to see you in person, online chat at some point during this session. But right now, my sincere apologies. I'm not able to do that. On that note, again, if you'd like to actually turn on your camera, feel free, but don't feel pressured to do it. And with that, I'd just actually like to get into our session, starting the day with a land acknowledgement. I recognize we're actually online, but I would like to honor the ground that the University of Windsor sits on, and I would actually like to comment to the territories and the different things connected with the land acknowledgement. So just as a general overview, as we gather today for the GATAcademy session, we acknowledge that this is sacred land on which we now operate. The University of Windsor proper sits on the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations, which includes the Anishinaabe, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi. My apologies. We acknowledge both land and water, as well as the treaties pertaining to the territory, and we also acknowledge the Haudenosaunee, who we share this territory with. We respect the long-standing traditions of the First Nations people in relation to this place and the 100-mile Windsor-Essex Peninsula and the Straits of Detroit. The territory was the subject to the Upper Canada Treaties, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe, and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. And today, Windsor-Essex is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work in the community on this territory. We are mindful of broken covenants and the need to reconcile our history and relations with Indigenous peoples. We acknowledge that the Canadian government did pursue a policy of cultural genocide to divest itself of its legal and financial obligations to Indigenous peoples and gain control over their land and resources. And we are mindful of the 2015 Truth and Reconciliation Commission call to action to address the legacy and impacts on Indigenous families and communities. And we acknowledge the call to action to abandon the colonial policies of the past, address colonial legacy, and to engage in a process of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples of Canada. We also acknowledge that we walk upon the territories and original nations of the First Peoples of the land whose children, families, adults, and seniors continue to cry out for justice. Now, with that said, I'm actually not a native Windsorite. I came to Windsor from Toronto, but I would like to acknowledge that a lot of what I learned about our Windsor territory came from actually the Center for Teaching and Learning and the courses offered that are available to you as GAs. Now, I'm just going to make mention of this. On page 3 of the GATAcademy brochure that you received, there's a link to it in your PDF to this session. On Thursday, there's anti-racism pedagogy and decolonializing pedagogy sessions with part of this series this week. And also below the link to the session that gives you the guidebook, there's links to the Center for Teaching and Learning. The Center for Teaching and Learning has an Indigenous coordinator, has lovely, lovely classes talking about Indigenous histories and impacts. And I would encourage you, it's part of your tuition and part of your role as a GA and TA to be able to access Center for Teaching and Learning courses for free and to also get certification in different topics. Please feel free to explore those and engage in them. They're usually hour to 2 hour sessions, and they're quite interesting, quite amazing, and quite knowledge impactful and filled. So the link, if you're looking, okay, I'll actually put it in the chat as well. But the link that you got in your email to join this session and every other session this week, it says if you'd like to register or cancel your registration for the course, that's the general link that'll take you to the page for the CTL. Also on page 43 of your guide, the actual guide of the PDF for the GATAcademy, is a whole list explaining the GATA and graduate student development opportunities. Thank you very much, Jennifer. And the CTL half courses and the CTL support courses. Those links to those pages will allow you to access everything and join everything, and also the type of certifications that Sula and I have taken. All right, I'm just going to move on beyond that. You can ask more questions at the end. This is just our agenda today quickly of the topics we're going to discuss for this session. What is assessment and why is it important? The types of assessment, what authentic assessment includes, specific elements of grading, what effective feedback is and what it looks like, and types of feedback and how to give feedback, which is why you're all here today, because you're interested in that. It's because it's a major part of your roles as GAs and TAs is the grading and feedback. With that note then, can I ask those of you who are actually able to respond, I have a feeling that some of you aren't because of your internet connectivity issues, would you mind writing on the poll slide? If you can use the pen indicator in the upper right corner to draw, or you can actually use the text indicator. Yep, you figured it out. Which department you're actually doing it in. If you hit the square with the T in the middle, that'll allow you to type. It might be easier for you if you're on a phone. It's probably easier to write. Okay, so it looks like it's a mix of FA and the STEM courses. Some of this might be a bit of a repeat. I know the STEM session this morning discussed some of the things we're going to talk about, and some of the other individual topic sessions in the week have overlapped. But for all of them, there is a certain degree of similarity. Wow, look at that. Okay. See a lot. There's a bunch of you who are actually in my old fields. Okay, sociology, that's great to have you here. Poli-sci, engineering. Okay. All right, wonderful. So it looks like it's about an even mix. Okay. All right, so we're going to cover the basics. For some of you who are in the STEMs, there's going to be a bit of a different, some of you, it's how, depends which way your professors do, but we'll actually get into some of this type of stuff. So with that, I'm just going to move on. The fact that you're here and you actually know what your course is means you actually received a notice of appointment to assistantship. That tells you your department, your role, your course, and the number of hours you've been actually equated to work for. It's wonderful. The reason we ask is last year when we asked, a lot of people didn't know. But it's wonderful that this year you do know. But it does mean then that you actually have had access to the basics of that. So you'll know who you're working for. Again, the resources this year for the GATAcademy, they put together a wonderful book. They have in that book, again, it's linked to through the link to this course and through your original link for registering. The resource pages 11 to 17 for the GATAcademy Program 21 covers most of these details in depth and providing actual details for actually things you can ask your professor that you're actually assigned to work with. So I'm not going to go over repeating what's in the book per se, but I do want to point out that after this course, or after this session, you can go back and look at that and use that as your reference, because it gives you specific details that cover for every course. So it's again, this notice of appointment to assistantship, you would have received it if you want to look back at what your formal contract should look like. On page 17, they give you a link to what one looks like. We've taken that out because they differ by department. But the fact that you're here means you've seen it, you've signed it, you're ready to work. But going into that, the Form 1 is the companion form to your notice of appointment. The Form 1 details exactly a description of your duties. This is something that you have to, by your mandate for your working term, discuss with your supervising professor. It outlines the hours to be allocated per task. It's a discussion that you should be having. The copy of the Form 1 is actually shown on page 12 of your GATA resource book. And it's going to actually be filled out originally as you go in to enter your appointment. And then there's a midterm review that takes place. As part of that midterm review, it discusses whether you are meeting the hours and you are meeting the requirements. So what we would suggest is that you keep somehow track of your hours when you've been assigned tasks, the hours that you put into marking, the hours that you put into doing online labs, the hours that you do training. It's again, not every one of the categories that is listed on the form will be pertaining to you. That's a discussion to have with your supervisors because every supervisor teaches their course differently and every course has different requirements. For instance, those of you in STEMs are more likely to have labs, where those of you in, say, political science are very unlikely to have more than one lab in your entire undergraduate or graduate degree. So it varies by type of what you're going to be doing. The only thing that is consistent is that most of you will be grading and assessing student work, and most of you will be having some kind of GA hour contacts because those are mandated. So go over those details, keep track of them, and then with that, we'll get into the meat and content of why you're here, the actual grading aspect of the role. What is authentic assessment and why is it important? Well, you're here, think about it, because people in your department have seen you as responsible and studious and intelligent enough to actually set examples for the students in the rest of the faculty to be able to do things like actually interact with them and mark them. And you have experience in the courses that you've been assigned to the extent that people do think you can oversee the other students. With that, think about your own experiences and try to actually think about what, as an undergraduate student, you taking those courses that you're actually now in charge of as a GA and TA, what would have been helpful to you when people gave you feedback and assessment, and what actually you've received in the past as assessment that wasn't helpful. Now, by the actual authenticity, my pronunciation is off, by what actual authentic assessment is actually considered, it meets with these principles as I've outlined them on the slide. Aligned, meaning it aligns with what's actually being discussed or talked within your course or the assignment itself. Practical and meaningful. Standards and reference are criterion based. That means when you're actually looking at an assignment, for instance, you're actually commenting on something that's pertinent to what you're actually assessing. Offers creativity and critical thought. Offers multiple learning domains and deep learning, and situated and relevant. By that, I mean, if you're looking at something and you're marking, for instance, an essay, you're probably going to be assessing it differently than a lab. So you offer something that can be considered, I would call it constructive criticism if possible, as opposed to telling someone it's just wrong or grammatically incorrect. But it's something that you kind of learn because your role as a assessment support is supervising your professor's objectives and alignment is noted in your syllabus. So with that, it's important to know what your syllabus is for the course that you're actually overseeing and what the assignment itself is asking of students. And then it's important to offer the kind of feedback that kind of relates to that. Now, some professors that you work with, some supervisors will tell you in a very detailed way what they want you to put, but more often than not, most of them will actually tell you to grade something by a way that you devise. And with that, you can offer comments that are practical and meaningful to actually you think would help you as a student if you were taking the course, and offer opportunity for providing knowledge that perhaps it wasn't offered in the session online, or knowledge for the student to grow and enhance their boundaries. Now we're going to go through this in a bit more detail. I don't want to kind of give away some of the points that Sue is going to cover, but my main suggestion here is to kind of think about yourself, put yourself in the situation of the student, knowing the guidelines of the course that you're actually oversighting, and don't be afraid to use your own judgment. You're placed in a role as a GA and a TA because the departments place great faith in you, in your understanding of the course topic, and knowledge that you do have a firm grounding in it. And don't be afraid to actually offer comments that you think will help the students, and do that in a way that you think could be practical and meaningful for alignment with the syllabus and the course itself. Now, okay. Just on that note, there's a varied group of you. So the reason why this gets a bit complicated and running a 45-minute session here with what I'm going through is every course is different and every subject is different, and there's multiple types of assessments. This chart just shows some of them. Like there's diagnostic assessments when you're looking at journal entries, student reflections, different things that can be done online. There's formative assessments when you're looking at things like portfolios and short regular quizzes. Summative, measuring students' progress in something. Norm reference assessments, usually having a standard and comparing to each group or comparing to a set of principles. Criterion and reference, which is common when you're looking at essays, comparing the score of an individual compared to others, or comparing a performance level, or comparing an indicator. And the last one, I have trouble pronouncing it, but it doesn't actually, it compares previous results with a second try. This is kind of common now in the humanities, where you have a entry level standard, especially I've been noticing in political science. You have an entry level where you do something as a first part of something, a lit review, you do something as a annotated bibliography, and then you work on a larger document that incorporates that. So what you're doing is you're comparing for students the comments and the reflection to improve upon their first attempt. And that's where it's helpful for you as a GA and TA to actually be providing assessment on that first attempt of ways they can improve. I'm just going to keep moving on because Sula is going to go through some of the practical stuff here. This is just a quote that I have found to actually be quite interesting and meaningful in this, that authentic assessment is a measurement of intellectual accomplishments that are worthwhile, significant, and meaningful. It says a lot in a little thing, but it's again tying back to your experience yourself as a student, because you're here both in a student capacity and as a GA and TA capacity. Think about what helped you the most in your courses and try to offer that experience to the students now that you're overseeing. Because generally the role is generally tied in, although it's not officially the role, it's somewhat of a mentorship role as a GA and TA, and these students are looking to you to be the expert, but also be their peer, having that understanding. And you can bring that aspect yourself that's a lot of the professors are far removed from, having taught for 10, 20, sometimes 30 years. It's been a long time since they've been in a classroom as a student, where very often if you're assigned to a supervising professor, you've taken that course with that same professor within the past 5 years. And you both understand the role of the professor you're working with as well as the course and what's expected in the course. And that's where you have the unique role in your department and in the course that you're assessing to actually have an understanding that can help the students along and be able to empathize with them with their issues and starting to learn the topic and starting to do the assignments that you're overseeing now. So again, tied into that, this ties into what I was saying about that Form 1. The typical duties of GAs and TAs include the preparation for classes, holding office hours, leading discussions and supervising laboratories, proctoring tests and midterms, and assisting in grading of labs, essays, tests, and term papers. Now, not everyone has all of those roles, and in some cases, the professionals will decide they want to do a lot of things themselves and only have you do a second pass, let's say at grading, or they'll only assign certain things to you for looking at. That's a discussion you have with your supervisors. But if you are assigned to grading, when we get into the feedback type of this, Sula's going to take you through some of the discussions on how to offer that. As well, I just kind of want to point out one of the things that many of you probably are here for. We're going to provide you with resources. As we're online now, grading for some of you is going to take on a very different onus than it used to in the past, in that you'll be grading on Blackboard. Now, we don't cover that in this session, but we are going to provide you a Blackboard tip sheet to the Grade Center. If you're new as a GA and you haven't used that function before, that tip sheet will tell you how to access it. And there's also in the Blackboard Help Center, through the links to that sheet we're providing you, there's online help. Grading isn't as overwhelming on the Blackboard system as you might think, but it does take getting used to. That's why we're not covering that specific aspect in this course. But don't be afraid of it. The tip sheet will help you with the access. If you're able to access Blackboard yourself for submitting assignments, essentially with grading, you just have extra functions yourself added by supervisory control. You're just accessing student things, and you're basically writing and reviewing things the same way you would as a student when you upload your own work. Professors will tell you exactly how. In some cases, you'll have to actually put things up and do rubric creation and that on your own. That's something I'm going to discuss in a later thing, but we're also providing you with a resource for that. And as always, there's Blackboard help. The GATAcademy gives you links to the Blackboard sites. We're going to give you the grade sheets. We're going to give you the rubric assessment. That's all going to be sent out in an email after this course. And at any time, the CTL and the Blackboard help always have online courses, modules that as a GA and TA you are able to join. And if there's always online help available 24/7 for you to be able to ask questions through Blackboard as well. You shouldn't be working under timelines that are so pressured that you have to be able to do things overnight. Most professors will figure out within the schedule, tell you what you're going to have to grade, if you're going to have to do assessments and grading, and you figure out a period to do it within. And we do suggest that within that, you have those discussions with your supervisors if they tell you you're grading and assessing work, to ask the timeline of turnover. Some courses are going to go faster than others, but most of them can give you a reasonable amount of time to learn as part of your training how to use the system, and a reasonable amount of time to be able to grade for the number of students they're asking you to do work for. And that ties into you keeping track of your hours as well. And on midterm, if you're finding it takes longer to do than you might have expected, that's when you have that discussion again to change the roles on your Form 1 on midterm review, so that you're not working overtime, so that you're not feeling pressured with as a student with a GA role and your own student role, and so things get done effectively. All right. As one of my main points before we get into the feedback stuff with Sula is conflict of interest. Again, it's one of those things that as a GA and TA doesn't tie in exactly with the grading, but it's very important. As you're grading work, you have to be aware of the fact that conflicts of interest can exist, and there's something that have to be recognized by you and pointed out to your supervisor, because there can be big consequences and big repercussions as you're kind of going through this, whether it's perceived, whether it's actually true or not, or whether it's just a matter of other students suspecting or feeling slighted. It doesn't matter. You have to be aware of and acknowledge prior relationships. That means if you're a GA or a TA and you see on your class list that assigned to your class are related to you in any way, siblings, cousins, family members of any sort, or you have a personal relationship of any kind of significance that you consider more than a passing acquaintance, someone you've dated, someone you work closely with, someone you've actually been a lifelong friendship with, someone that you're actually on a sports collaboration team with or something, the potential exists for there to be a bias, whether it's known or unknown, in the grading, or whether it could be perceived by someone else. Someone suggesting that possibly because you're marking your sibling or you're marking your good friend or you're marking someone you dated, that the mark you assigned to someone could be better or worse than something you would give to someone who's completely outside of the conflict realm. Important notice, whether you think it's a problem or not, if there is a chance of there being a perceived issue, it's a relationship you have to acknowledge to your supervisor, because if it's a perceived thing that you might actually identify and anyone else could identify as a possible conflict of interest, then probably you shouldn't be marking work for that student. It should go to another assigned TA or GA in your course, or it should have extra supervisory oversight with your supervisor. Either they mark the work themselves or they pay particular interest to making sure the grading aligns with the rest of your work. Supervisors on their own differ. Some supervisors allow you to grade outright and don't check for the whole class. Other ones recheck everything. Some divide work between multiple GAs. Sometimes you're the only GA in a course. So regardless of the situation and the courses you've been assigned, if there is any potential in your list, like I said, of any of these people being considered a conflict relationship, where there might be a conscious or unconscious bias in how you view their work, please acknowledge it to your supervisor and it will be worked out. Or at least they have the knowledge of oversight, so if anyone does come back and complain or say anything, or does come up for discussion, the fact that you have had the discussion with your supervisor is something that you have for your own safety and your own personal responsibility within your role. And moving on from that, rubric design. Now, as I noted, we are actually going to provide you with sheets for this, but rubric design, the reason why we actually have this in here is when you're given something to grade and assign, most often, unless it's a math course or unless it's a STEM course, there isn't a general right or wrong answer all the time. And even when there is a right or wrong answer, sometimes it's a flexible to a degree. If a professor tells you exactly how to mark, if your supervisor tells you exactly what they want to see, you go by what they actually outline. They'll actually sometimes tell you that the answer has to be this or it's completely wrong. In the case of a mathematical problem, or in the case of a, fill in the blank, or a case of some of those type things, it's a definite right, a definite wrong, or 6 points of democracy. You have to list all 6, and if you don't have 6, if you have 5, it's 5 out of 6, whatever. Sometimes it's clear cut, but more often than not, it's not. And more often than not, especially if it's a written assignment, you'll be told to actually assess them compared to each other's or compared to what the syllabus says. In that case, it's suggested that so you have a way of comparing and contrasting the grades that you're giving for fairness across the whole group of people that you're marking, you set up a rubric of your own to figure out how you're actually going to assess them comparatively. So you don't get into these questions of, for instance, conflict, or questions of, I marked yesterday this group and they got better marks than this group. You have a way of kind of doing a comparison. As I stated, we're giving you the chart, but the basic idea is choosing what you're looking at to mark, your domains. So by that, you go back to the original assignments. You go back to see, for instance, in my democracy example with political science, what the question is asking, and then you figure it out from there. If a question is asking what are the 6 levels of democracy, it makes sense to know the 6 levels yourself, and then figure it out as a percentage of the mark that the question's worth, and how you're going to actually assess that. Levels of achievement. Sometimes you actually have a bit of sway in whether you're marking an essay, let's say in terms of grammar, in terms of topic relevance. It's up to you to kind of figure out, if a professor doesn't already tell you how to do it, a way that you think seems logical based on your knowledge of looking at how you can compare. A good example I use with this is when you're looking at assessing a bibliography and references. You can do it by quantity, you can do it by quality, and you can do it by relevance. And you can actually put them on a grid. So for instance, if you're asked to do a paper and you're assessing the bibliography, the relevance of the sources used, your academic sources or not, the number of them that you have, and the relevance to the topic. Sometimes people will pick sources that are academic in nature and very relevant as far as academic goes, but as far as the topic of the course and the essay, they've gotten way off track. So it's things like that, figuring it out, because not only if you're figuring it out, sometimes when the students will come to you after and they'll ask how it's assessed, you want to have a way of explaining how you're thinking kind of in logic tied into the rubric design and the assessment. Working on your descriptions ties in with that. By the example I gave you, academic, when you're talking about bibliography, you'd want to know what your professor and your department would consider an academic resource for the context. Sometimes government resources would be included in that, sometimes not, to be able to talk with students. And very often you would hope that as part of their assignment, students already have been told some of these aspects themselves. But if not, again, it's for your judgment, knowing the course at the level you're targeting. You wouldn't expect the same for a first-year group of undergraduate as you would a third-year group of undergraduates. By third year, you expect students know more about things for grammar, academic sources, relevance to the topic design, than you would someone who's just starting out in a first-year course in a first semester. And that's, again, where your level of experience and your empathy for understanding ties in to how you assess the students. And again, choosing the rating system is going to tie in with the mark values and how you would assess it if you're doing it on your own. Tied in with this, it's another thing. We're giving you the design for rubric design, and we're giving you the grid for you if you're left to do it on your own. Rubric design in Blackboard is another thing by component. For the same thing that we're giving you for Blackboard Help, the Blackboard itself has a whole category on rubric design if you're left to do it on your own. But essentially the idea is you form the grid in your own mind. You do it by this chart that we give you, and you transfer that chart to a Blackboard format. So the technical aspects you can look up online through the Blackboard Help and the Blackboard resources. But essentially the grid that we're giving you is a standardized grid for designing rubrics. And moving on from that, I'm just going to turn it over to Sula now for a discussion about feedback and giving you the examples to what I've tied into. All yours, Sula.
Okay. Hi, everybody. So, so a component of grading is feedback. So even if you may be grading and you may not be grading as a GA or a TA, but regardless, students will come to you and probably ask for some type of feedback, whether it's you grading a paper or the instructor. So after a student submits the assignment, obviously there is the opportunity to provide that feedback. And feedback promotes learning and helps students improve. And we will also learn through the presentation that it doesn't always have to be at the end of the assignment. So ongoing feedback can be just as effective. So the four things that we're going to be learning today is what is feedback, and we're going to use that in an educational context. Why is it important, the types of feedback, and how to give effective feedback. Okay. So what is feedback? So you have the current performance of a student, which is usually assessed by some type of an assignment, and there you go, that is the current performance. Then if you add the information or the feedback you provide, it would equal to the desired performance, which is the learning outcome, what you want them to learn. So you can see here the feedback is a very important part of the learning process. So what is quality criteria? Yeah, so what is the criteria? That's a good point, Natalie. So, you know, that is where you would have maybe a rubric at that point that you can refer back to. when you're giving feedback and say, here's what we were looking for that question. Yes. What is the expectation? Absolutely. Yep. Good feedback. Thank you. So what do students want to know? The criteria and the grading scheme, similar to what Linda was going through in the rubric. How will I be marked for this? What is the criteria? Then after the assignment, how did I get this mark? How was it derived? What specifically got me this mark? If you write an essay and you get a mark of, A plus even, let's say, but there's no feedback, no written feedback, you get no verbal feedback, why, what did I do right? What do I repeat for the next assignment? And so it's important for students to know, what can I improve for next time? Why should I bother to improve for next time? So a lot of times, the students want to know why is this question or why is this content that I'm learning relevant to me? Is it relevant to the next course? Does it build on the next concept? Is it relevant to me in my career in the future? So the more you can tie this information that they're learning to future information, why it's important, the more motivated that they will be to learn the concepts. Okay, so this is where you can provide feedback, all of this information. Okay, so a quote. So this information that Linda and I are sharing, it's not just based on our experience or what we think. It's based on the research that we've done for this presentation. And you can see a quote by Hattie from 1999. Feedback has a significant impact on learning. It has been described as the most powerful single moderator that enhances achievement. So imagine the impact you can have as a GA or TA. A lot of times students feel more comfortable going to the GA or TA for feedback, and you'll be the first point of contact. So you want to make sure you're giving that accurate information as well, but the feedback that you provide could be very meaningful in their learning journey. Okay. Let me just check to my notes here. So why is feedback important to students when they learn? So we did cover some of the reasons. The motivation to learn is it's important for their motivation in the process of their learning. But there was a researcher, Nickel, who suggested that there's never enough dialogue in learning. So if the students only get written feedback, that's not enough. It's only a one way of communication. Students need to know why they received their mark, what they did right, and what they could do to improve for the future. And so you want to get them to start thinking about how they can evaluate their own assignments in the future. So not just the current assignment, but getting them to go through the thinking process of how they, how to think as a TA or a GA or as a professor, so they can critique their own paper or their own test before they submit it. Okay. So it's important in terms of motivation, providing students steps to improve, helping them to evaluate their own learning, and of course, reward qualities in student work. You could read the slide, obviously. So what is effective feedback? So you want to make sure that feedback is appropriate, it's relevant to the course, it's prompt and timely. You want to give a brief summary of the assignment so they can perhaps they didn't understand the assignment. So I think that's a very important step to go over. Here are what the expectations were, and here is how you met the expectations or how you didn't meet the expectations. And you want to balance the comments with negative and positive. So it's important for them to have those positive comments so they know how they can repeat that in the next or those behaviors in the next assignment. And you want to use, turn the criticism into something positive. Also, make sure you're not using language that they don't understand or terminology that's way over their head. If you're a GA in a chemistry class and you're teaching first year chemistry, or you're holding a lab, you don't want to use concepts that they may have not learned yet. So always make it more of a conversational language when you're giving feedback from things that they understand. Help them to learn how to approach answers. Absolutely, yes, Arash. Thank you for that. I like that. So suggest specific ways to improve the assignment. Yes, so they have next steps on how they can improve for the next time, and focused on more important concerns. Yeah, so you don't want to just overwhelm them with like a million little things. You really want to focus on what's important. I always love to give like step-by-step methods because I'm that type of person who just likes to see it laid out. But here's a suggested steps to effective feedback. So start off with something positive and encouraging. Give a brief summary of the assignment. Provide your feedback and explain the comments. Make general suggestions on how you would go about the next assignment. And next one is important. Ask questions to encourage reflections. So you don't always want to just give the answers. You want to say, look, you got the correct formula on this assignment, and you solved the question. Here was the purpose of the assignment. It was to explain the results, to see if you are able to interpret results. So I see you're missing that interpretation. How do you think you could improve for next time? So instead of saying, so you have identified the problem and the gap, and now you're saying, well, what do you think you could do next time? So it's getting them to think about and actually say themselves what they're going to do. They're more likely to remember your conversation. And then give them a follow-up question. So, okay, so here's a question. How would you approach this question as a next step? Take that home, come back tomorrow, and we can look over it. And this way they have a chance to work on their mistakes, and that way they'll remember a little bit more. So offer your help and support. Okay. So what do I have next? So written feedback. Okay. So here are just some, tips on if you're just, giving written feedback. You want to make sure it's understandable, and like I said, expressed in the language that students will understand. Not too complex, reasonable, detailed, not super detailed, but not too general. Specific, so being specific on a certain paragraph. Timely and contextualized, so reference to to certain learning outcomes or assessment criteria. So ongoing feedback is important. So not just at the very end of an assignment or a presentation or anything like that. So if there's a chance for students to practice, then ongoing feedback is very useful in the learning process. Okay, so in terms of additional points for written feedback, you want to be focused on the learning goals and not just the performance. So not just about the grade. You want to talk about what they learned from the assignment, and so you can do that with describing, so you don't have to focus on you got an A or you got a D. You can say, well, I see you learned this, this, and this, where it's going to carry you forth in this course, in the future course. Again, you want to be balanced in terms of positives and areas of improvement, and transferable. So, we mentioned this before, you want to focus on the process and skills. How did they get there to that question answer? So like a math teacher who wants to see your work, what was the thinking process? How did you analyze this? Those are all the skills that are transferable to future math questions, right? And personal. So if a student has been struggling on a certain concept and they keep coming back to you. So if when you give feedback, you can, mention, I see you've worked really hard on this. You were struggling and now you're doing great. Maybe not in those terms, but I see you've learned the concept of this. So referring to what's already known about the student or his previous work makes it a little bit more personal. And of course, Linda touched on this, you want to be fair. So if someone comes to see you in your office hours and you give special feedback to the student, and you feel like it would be useful to the rest of the group, why not send out a message to the rest of the group? That way it's fair and everyone's on the same page. And of course, suggest ways to improve on the next assignment. Yes, how do you draw the line between too detailed and not detailed enough? Yeah, I mean, this would go back to the learning outcomes, I would say, how and what the professor wants the student to learn. Certain courses will probably want high level, only, not too much detail, just a certain concept to understand. Others will want you to go in very detail. So I guess you're probably referring to feedback. So I think if the student understands your general feedback and is receptive to that, that's where it's better to be in person. Then you can go a little bit deeper and a little bit deeper. But if the student has a hard time grasping even just the general feedback, I would just, focus on one step at a time. So starting with something more general and then going a little bit more specific and so on. Okay. Okay, oh my. So there's all kinds of different, I was gonna put this out to there, guys, and say, I'm sure you've heard of all these different types of feedback, informal, formal feedback, summative. So summative, you evaluate student learning at the end of the unit by some type of a standard or benchmark. Formative assessment or feedback is ongoing feedback throughout the course. So in order to prevent students from making the same mistake and helping them progress to the next learning stage. Peer feedback is also useful. I can say I did my MBA years ago, but I can honestly say that I probably learned just as much from learning in groups and getting feedback in my group, my student group, than I did from the instructor. So I think peer feedback is very important, and self-feedback, starting to think about assessing yourself and how you can improve, and becoming an independent learner, and learning how to measure against those learning outcomes and clarifying success criteria, asking questions, determining those next steps. And of course, we have constructive feedback. So this is more feedback on a specific or issue focused, based on just observations. And then we have our negative feedback and positive feedback, but I'm sure you all are familiar with those. Okay. So let's talk about saving time. Some of you might be a GA for 20 or 30 people, or TA, and some of you might be a GA for 300, a class of 300. And usually there's multiple GAs for those classes. However, what can save you time? Giving group feedback, taking advantage of technology. So, I know professors do this all the time. They'll create an automatically a quiz in Blackboard that automatically marks, but you can include feedback in each of, so if they choose A, then you can have specific feedback for A, and they get it automatically. They get it, it meets the criteria of timely feedback. And so using technology, Blackboard has that ability to do automatically marked quizzes and provide specific feedback for A, B, C, D. And then harnessing student energy, and that is, the more actively students are engaged in their own learning, the deeper and more significant the learning will be. And so, having them reflect on their own understanding and providing feedback to each other in draft stages. The assignment can also be very powerful. Okay, in artistic setting, it's possible that Jay becomes a student in any given, yes, this is great way to approach any learning environment, in my opinion. Yes, so Lindsay was saying in visual art, GA becomes the student in any given eval. So as a GA, you're also a student. Yeah, that's great. You guys are funny. So questions somewhat off topic. Some students give way too much information hoping that something is right. What do you recommend in those situations? Student hasn't really differentiated what is required. Okay, so you're saying that some students that are writing an exam or an essay just throw everything on their paper, hoping that something hits. And what do you recommend? So I guess going back to the learning outcome, so each question or assessment should tie directly to the learning outcome in the course. And so it should, we call that alignment. And so if you can show the student which learning outcome it's tied to, and then going to the teaching materials and saying, okay, so here's what we wanted you to learn on your learning outcome. Here are the materials that this professor provided. And here's, and sometimes they need to be like, here's the focus. So tying that directly to the learning outcomes might help them focus more, and then to the teaching materials on just those few points that you're looking for, rather than, you know, having them, you know, just throw anything there, right? And being focused. So I think, you know, sometimes they do that, you know, probably because they don't know how to answer the question, so they just keep writing and writing, right, hoping something is right. So clarifying what you're looking for, I think, might help. I don't know if Linda has anything else to add to that. Yes, so thank you, and we'll just, if there's, Linda, if there's anything you'd like to add?
No, just I've been really encouraged by the feedback online. And that is one thing just I've learned as a GA over my 8th term I'm going into now. When you'll find that there is a lot of repetition when you're doing things, grading and assessing. And sometimes it's helpful to come up with ways to make your life easier. For instance, I saw Samara kind of commented the suggestion of offering students the links to the writing support desk and the different resources that the University of Windsor offers. That's a good way to kind of take the onus off you teaching 80, 90 individual students, or 50, 60, depending on the course, individual elements, say, of putting together an essay, but rather showing students the OWL resources and the writing support desk resources for how to format, right? I'm sorry, was that you, Sula? Did you just come in? No?
No, I don't know what that was.
Okay,
It's
feedback.
okay.
But anyway, that kind of thing. And also you'll notice if you're grading online, when you're offering feedback, rather than typing in, sometimes I find it's actually a good idea to open a separate sheet in a Word document and kind of put up comments that I use generally, you know, things like linking them to, for instance, how to do an APA bibliography, or how to improve upon things, or how to understand what an academic resource is. You'll find as you go over grading and assessing things that there's certain consistencies that some students will have and other ones won't get. And what you can do is you can keep a separate sheet, so you're copying and pasting comments in rather than retyping them multiple and multiple times, as part of the feedback, as a way to guide students, like we've been doing in the links. There's going to be a couple of things that'll be helpful, you'll realize, with your course, depending on what you're assessing, that'll become a common standard. And for you to have that ready rather than to just kind of keep repeating and repeating and retyping, it'll take down the amount of time you spend on providing that formative feedback in the actual doing it online aspect. And again, we're giving you a bunch of resources. They're going to come out with the email. We do hope they help. And our contact is also listed. If there's anything we said that you'd like further follow-up on, please feel free to email us as well, and take our resources and use them, and hopefully make use of the links. And my only last comment is I wish you all the best in your term as GAs and TAs this term. I've been very heartened by seeing how well you're doing just starting this, taking this course. We did this last year and we didn't have as many students get the same answers that you provided. It's really nice going into this new year to see that already and show that and have you here just participating, showing you care. So I wish you all the best, and I hope as students you have a good term, and both as GAs and TAs you have a good term as well. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Sula. And I look forward to possibly meeting some of you in the future on campus. I'll probably be around another 4 years doing a PhD, so I look forward to that in the future, meeting you and seeing you, and you're possibly taking over this GATA teaching role down the road too.
Okay, thanks, Linda. Yes, just to reiterate, thank you everybody for participating and being active participants in our session. And yes, feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions. And we do wish you all the best in your roles as GAs and TAs. And thank you for your contributions and your dedication to the University of Windsor. Much appreciated.